Welcome back to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you have any questions or comments, send them to am950radio.com. So on today's show, we're going to finish the last two amendments to the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So we're going to continue on our journey through the Constitution, and now after today we'll have the first 10 amendments done, and then we have 17 more to cover. However, some of those I think we'll cover a little faster than some other ones. But you may be asking, like, on some of these you're probably going to say, well, why is that in the Constitution? So I'll try and answer those as we go along and finish out the other 17. And then we're going to talk about some of the legal cases that I mentioned last week, where Trump's getting sued left and right about all these, things that they're trying to do, shutting down agencies and cutting off money and all that. So I'll talk some more about that, and then we'll finish up the last segment about some politics going on, touch about a little bit here in Minnesota, and then, there's just so much to talk about that changes, every darn day. But hopefully I can get through some of the current stuff. So that'll be the third section for today. So let's start with the Ninth Amendment then, which is one of the shorter ones of the first 10. And this reads simply, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's all it says. But this is one of those where, not a lot of words here, but there's certainly a disagreement over what they mean. Which, again, I've said a lot on my shows here, is that ultimately it's basically what the Supreme Court says it is in the end, and that's the case here too. But this one, something to watch for in future cases, is this is one of those amendments where it gives the judges and lawyers some leeway to make some other arguments to get more rights for people that aren't put in the Constitution. So there are some general principles here with this Ninth Amendment. Basically, this amendment says that there could be rights out there that the people have that were not expressly put into the Constitution. So we talked previously about how, there's all these rights that Congress has, right, in Article 1, Section 8. And it says in there that states have, or don't have some rights, Congress don't have some rights. So, it lists some of these things. And then we have the prior 8 amendments that have, our rights against the government. So what this one is another one of these what I call catch-all amendments or catch-all laws, which basically mean that, well, this covers some other stuff that maybe we didn't expressly put into the Constitution. Because, despite what the originalists like to argue, the Founding Fathers did write the Constitution to be a living document where it can change over time as society and its people changes. So, in other words, the Constitution is not an exclusive list, and this is the only things that you can do, or these are the only rights that you have. Congress and the courts can come up with other ones. So, an example of these are where you have rights to privacy, for example. You don't see rights to privacy in the Constitution anywhere. But the Supreme Court used the Ninth Amendment to come up with some of our privacy rights. So even though, again, they're not like specific things found in the Constitution, this Ninth Amendment is used to make more rights for us that the courts at least say that, exist. So during the, it wasn't used a whole lot by the Supreme Court prior to the 1960s. Then you started seeing it come up more and more because during the 60s, this is the time in our history where the civil rights actions were going on, and women's rights actions were going on in the 60s and the 70s. So you started seeing the court use the Ninth Amendment. And one of the types of cases is privacy rights. So this is how they came up with the right to contraception in the Griswold versus Connecticut case. They came up and said, well, the Ninth Amendment has, allows these other rights. So they came up with the right to privacy. Okay, so the amendment has also been used by the Supreme Court to find a right to travel in the Constitution, even though it doesn't say that, right? There's the right to vote in the Constitution, even though the Constitution, somewhat surprisingly to some people, it doesn't say that you have a right to vote specifically in there. But the courts have found under the Ninth Amendment that, yes, we do, even though it's not specifically mentioned. And then, of course, we have certain privacy rights, like, again, contraception. This is one of the amendments they used in the deciding Roe versus Wade in the abortion case. Now, of course, the Supreme Court changed the Roe versus Wade decision and the Dobbs decision, just ignoring the Ninth Amendment, when they made that decision. But this also gives us our rights to make decisions about our own health care or our own body. So this is one of the amendments that people who, for example, want the right to kill themselves, if they're terminally ill, or they don't want to be on machines the rest of their life when they're basically brain dead. Those sorts of cases. The Supreme Court has said, yeah, you have some rights under the Ninth Amendment to lay out what your health care, what you want that to be, and what your end of life care should be. So these are some of the things that the Ninth Amendment has been used by the courts to find, rights that have not been specifically laid out in the Constitution. And you're going to see some other groups arguing in the future to have rights of some sort. And they're going to use this Ninth Amendment to say, yeah, give us some more rights. Because this is not an exclusive list. So, again, it's going to be up to the Supreme Court, if they're going to find some or not. Now, I suspect that the current Supreme Court isn't going to find any more rights for people, and, they've taken one away with the abortion right, effectively saying, well, we're going to leave it to the states, and, of course, a lot of the states are getting rid of it. So we'll have to see if, any more rights come out of the Supreme Court. But I don't think it's going to happen with this current Supreme Court. Matter of fact, you might see them take it away. For example, there's talk about some of them to get rid of gay marriage. From their previous decision, and hopefully they don't do that. But that was one of the Ninth Amendment was part of that decision too. So we'll see what they do in the future. Now, the 10th Amendment has some similarities to the Ninth Amendment regarding rights reserved to not just the people, but also to state governments. So this is another place where state governments kind of show up in the Constitution. So here's what the 10th Amendment says. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So that's the 10th Amendment. So here again, there's some specific things mentioned in here, but also a lot of vague words being used. Not the Bill of Rights not really giving us a lot of direction, but again, this is the Supreme Court says what it means, at least at some point in history. So this is the 10th Amendment is referring to those Article 1 powers by Congress. So when they're talking about not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, that's what they're referring to, is the powers given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. And also there's parts in the Constitution in Article 1 that deny some powers to the state governments. That's in Section 10, Article 1, Section 10. And one of the areas where there's some disagreement between, under the law is the 18th clause in Article 1, Section 8, which I talked about a couple times before, where it says Congress has powers or can use powers that are necessary and proper to put into place those 17 previous clauses. Right, so there's that catch-all in there, and that's an area where you see some of the fights between the state governments and the federal governments over, who has the power to do certain things. But basically what the 10th Amendment it was in there for, and if you go back and read some of the stuff that James Madison wrote about it while they were, arguing over what to put in there, basically what they're saying here is that, well, if the power doesn't belong to the federal government, well, then it belongs to the state governments or to the people. So there are times where you will see some people going into court saying, hey, these rights are for the people. They're not for the federal government. They're not for the state government, but they're for the people. Because, it says that in there. Now, I haven't seen a whole lot of cases argue that specifically, but normally it's the federal government versus the state government, and they're fighting over power or money. Again, my definition of politics is power plus money equals politics. Right? And this also fits into our federalism system of government, where you have the three levels of government. You have the federal government, you have the state government, you have your local governments, and they're fighting over who has the power to do certain things and who has the money to either, tax us or, get money from us or spend money. Or in some cases, send grant money to various places. So so that part about or to the people isn't really used that much. Normally it's to the state or the federal government, who has the power to do something or who has the money to deal with this. So this amendment was put in place to help further define the balance of power between the federal and the state governments. So this amendment is often used by state governments when they think that the federal government is overstepping their power. So they go into court and often raise the 10th Amendment as one of their claims, saying the federal government doesn't have this power under the Constitution, and it's not one of those necessary and proper clause type powers. So the state governments should have the power to do certain things. Or it's a way for the states, to deal with money issues. So some of these typical things now that throughout the years the Supreme Court has said is that states typically have what are called police powers, where they have powers to protect the people in their states and, to regulate the state government and in some cases to, put some powers in there so that they have some checks and balances over the federal government. So things like, police protection, fire departments, state criminal laws, are these police powers as well as I mentioned before, if you want to get a divorce, you that's state law stuff, child support, all those, family law type issues are all state matters. And zoning laws are an example of, state powers. So, there's all kinds of things, and then what state, allows licenses for people in their states to do various trades and jobs and all that. Like for my attorney's license, right? I have to get one through the state of Minnesota, through the Supreme Court of Minnesota. So these are all types of police powers that the states use for things under their jurisdiction. So a couple areas where you see the fights going on, at least these days in the courts, are when Congress tries to use its Commerce Clause powers to regulate interstate commerce. And remember, that means commerce among the states or with the Indian tribes or with foreign countries. where they're saying, hey, we have the power to regulate this stuff. And then the states come in and say, well, no, you don't. This isn't really a Commerce Clause issue, or it's not an interstate commerce case at all. So you're overstepping your powers, and it should be something we do. So that's our power, not your power kind of arguments. You'll see with the interstate commerce clause. And you're seeing some of these again with gun laws as well, where the states are saying, hey, we have certain rights under the 10th Amendment to deal with guns, in spite of, and the federal government doesn't. So you see those sorts of cases as well. All right, so that is the 9th and 10th Amendments. So now we're done with the Bill of Rights. So we'll keep going with the other 17 amendments. So we're going to take our first break here, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the legal cases that the Trump administration is in hot water over. So we'll talk to you on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to another segment of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. So the second segment here is going to be about some of the lawsuits that I mentioned in last week's show that are being filed against the Trump administration and DOJ, and all of these things that the Trump administration is doing. And last night, so that was Tuesday night as I'm taping this on a Wednesday, I was looking around like, has Trump won any of these lawsuits yet? And no, he hasn't, at least as far as I can tell. Now, of course, that may change by the time you hear this show, but at least right now, as of taping here, he's lost all of these court cases so far, which is, again, as I mentioned last week, I'm not that surprised about. There's even some Trump-appointed judges that have ruled against him, and other Republican judges. Like there was one that was appointed by Reagan, one appointed by George W. Bush that have come out and said, you can't be doing this. So I'm going to talk about that for some of these cases in this segment here. So, again, all of the judges, at least that I can tell, have ruled against Trump and whatever the administration's doing here. So one of the cases has gone to a hearing in front of the Federal Court of Appeals. So all these cases start at the trial court level, or in a federal court. Sometimes they call them district court level, where you have one judge making a decision. So Trump loses, and then he appeals it to the Court of Appeals, where typically you have 3 judges hearing those. And they're looking over what the trial court judge did to see if there's some error of law that the judge made. One of those cases has made it to the Court of Appeals, and they found in favor of the lower court decision, which said, no, Trump, you can't do this. This deals with the case where they're stopping payment of some of the money that Congress has approved to pay or appropriated to pay under what's called the Appropriations Clause in the Constitution that we talked about before. And the judges have said, well, no, you can't just stop appropriations by Congress, that they are laws. And part of the executive branch, in Article 2, it talks about the president is supposed to faithfully execute the laws. Trump is, of course, changing the laws, at least he's trying to, or avoiding doing what the laws are. And these judges are saying, no, you got to go through with this stuff. And I'll talk about later whether, what's going to happen if Trump says, well, screw you, judges, I ain't going to do it. But so that's a whole other issue I'll get to here in a little bit. But we've had that decision now. And there's been new lawsuits since last week. So there's a new one that is fighting the layoffs/closing of the Department of Education. So that's come under fire lately, and Trump has said, he's going to basically get rid of it. So there's a lawsuit filed there. There's been a court case to restore websites at the CDC, the National Institute of Health, and the FDA. These are brought by doctors who saying, look, we use these websites to get medical information and to see what's going on with particularly viruses, and all these potential pandemic type things coming again, the bird flu and those sorts of things. So a bunch of doctors got together and filed a lawsuit saying, hey, just, put this stuff back up because this is hurting, our ability to learn more things and care for our patients. And the court found in favor of the doctors on that one. So basically what is going on with these cases is that the trial court judges are saying, they're issuing what's called a temporary restraining order or a temporary injunction. Okay, and basically what these are is plaintiffs are, the people that are suing the Trump administration, they're called the plaintiffs. They're filing these cases, and they're asking these judges for a temporary restraining order or a temporary injunction, basically saying, order the Trump administration to stop doing this stuff that they're doing. And in some of these cases, put it back to where it was, before you got rid of stuff. And, to follow the existing laws, like with, paying what Congress has appropriated. And then the judge, assuming the judge issues these, then the judge later on has a hearing where the Trump administration can come in and make all their arguments as to why, the judge shouldn't do these injunctions or temporary restraining orders. And then the judge makes a decision after a hearing on those to either keep the temporary injunction in place or potentially to make it a permanent injunction. So what most of these judges are doing and are doing the temporary ones and then ordering a hearing. And some of these hearings are starting to take place now, by the way. So you might be seeing some more decisions on these coming out in the near future. Now, in order to get these temporary injunctions or temporary restraining orders, it's a high bar. I mean, plaintiffs just can't run into court and say, hey, judge, I want a temporary order, please. And the judge signs off on it and, away they go. That's not how it works. Okay? A judge basically has to find two things to issue these restraining orders, these temporary restraining orders. Number one, the plaintiff will suffer irreparable harm if the judge doesn't, stop whatever it is the plaintiffs are asking the judge to stop. Now, it doesn't say, just stop harm to the plaintiff. It says irreparable. In other words, it's such an emergency that, you got to stop things right now. Put a pause on it right now, and then and then you can have a hearing on it later, or even a later trial on it, right? To when everybody can present their evidence, and then a judge or a jury can make a decision on these things. So you have to find, number one, irreparable harm, which is a high bar. I mean, you have to be able. The plaintiffs have to show that they're going to suffer some harm that won't be repaired, basically, unless the judge stops it. Second thing is, and this is another high bar, the judge has to find that the plaintiffs will likely win in court. So if a judge says, well, yeah, you might suffer some irreparable harm, but I don't think you're going to win on the merits in court, judge won't issue the temporary injunctions or temporary restraining orders. The plaintiffs have to likely win on the merits before a judge can issue these. And all these judges are issuing them, by the way. I haven't heard of a case where a judge has said, no, I'm not going to issue a temporary restraining order. Or, no, I've had a hearing and I'm going to get rid of it, my previous temporary restraining order. Haven't heard one of those yet. And let's hope we don't. Because, again, I think these are good cases that are being brought, I think. So judges just, the point here is judges can't just willy-nilly give these, temporary restraining orders. The plaintiff has to show they're going to suffer irreparable harm if a judge doesn't step in. And the judge has to find that the plaintiffs are going to likely win the court case. So one of my students asked me in class the other day, he's like, well, why does Trump keep losing these cases? Well, mainly because he's breaking laws. He's breaking federal laws when he's doing these things. Or he's breaking the procedure that he's supposed to go through before he can do the things that he wants to do. So in some of these cases, you have to follow under federal law or under for example, the Administrative Procedures Act. You have to go through a certain process before you can, get rid of employees or fire them all, or fire some of them. You have to go through these steps. Or if you're an employee that belongs to a union and there's a union contract, the union contract often has, you got to go through these steps before you can get rid of somebody. And oftentimes in these procedures and rules, you have to find just cause to get rid of an employee. And Trump isn't bothering with that. He's just firing everybody or people he doesn't like. There's no hearing on just cause. Plus, a lot of these cases, the person that's getting fired has a right to appeal those decisions and have a hearing and those sorts of things. And Trump is, he's just basically denying those too. So that's why he's losing all of these cases. Is he's trying to do things he doesn't have the power to do. So he can't just close the Department of Education because he wants to. Congress was the one that set him up. Set up all these agencies. Congress is the one that does these, not the president. And Congress is the one that has to shut them down. If Congress says at some point, and they get enough votes to shut down the Department of Education, then it's going to get shut down. But that's not what's happening here. Congress has not done this. It's just Trump through an executive order saying, I can do this, I have the power to do this, so I'm going to do this. No, he doesn't. And again, that's why he's losing. Now, I'm sure his lawyers are telling him, you're gonna lose these cases, probably. But he's just going through this because he's trying to see where the limits are. See if these judges, and some of them again were Trump appointed judges, and they're ruling against him right now. But he just has to find one, that's going to let him do it. All right, so he's just doing things that he doesn't have the power to do. And as I mentioned before, executive orders, are not in the Constitution, but what the Supreme Court has ruled about them over the years has been, the president can do it if it is something he has the power to do, and it doesn't somehow violate, the Constitution. A court can say, well, either A, no, you don't have the power to do that, or B is like, well, yeah, you have the power to do it, but the way you did it is unconstitutional, so we're not letting you do this. So a court can overturn executive orders, and this is what they're doing. So I think a couple of other things are going on here to kind of watch for. Judges aren't buying into what Trump and Musk are trying to sell, the people. Musk is nothing except the richest man in the world who thinks he's the president of the United States. He's not elected to anything. Trump just appointed him to some obscure job in the White House. And now that's morphed into Doge, which is not an executive agency or anything. It's just some committee that Trump set up. And Musk is trying to get unfettered power to do whatever he wants, like firing workers, and cutting budgets and trying to shut down the government. He does, parts of the government he doesn't like. He's basically acting like a king or a president. And, Trump's going along with it. And judges simply aren't buying this, at least so far. Plus, and here's a big thing, you hear Trump and Musk out there saying, we have found millions and billions of dollars of waste and fraud in the government, and we got to get rid of it. No, they haven't. If they did, they would present it to a court. They haven't presented anything to a court. And this is part of the problem. They don't have any evidence to support their waste of clean, abuse and fraud going on. If you did, if they did, they would show it. So this is just all a big lie. I know it's a shock. Trump lying, Musk lying. But this is all they're doing. They're just lying. They're just lying, saying, "Oh, we found all these." Well, no, you haven't. I haven't heard one example of any kind of fraud, waste, or abuse that they have found. And until they come out and say something like that, judges should say, "Hey, you haven't shown us nothing, so why are you doing this? Why are you cutting all these budgets and cutting all these workers and all this stuff? No evidence, no go. Sorry." Now, another reason that I think judges are ruling against all of these cases is because they know that their powers are being tested right now. And they're fighting back against attempts by the administration to do whatever the hell they want to do, regardless of what judges say in their rulings. Of course, this is something that I and many others have predicted after the Supreme Court's ludicrous presidential immunity decision. Trump is going to test this by pushing as far as he can and see what he can get away with. So judges understand what's going on here, and they're preparing for cases where the Trump administration will basically give the middle finger to the court. Now, Trump was on TV yesterday saying, "Oh, I abide by all court orders, and then I just appeal them all." Basically is what he's saying. Well, we're going to find out if he's going to abide by these temporary injunctions that these courts are issuing. A couple of these cases, they're not. A judge brought them back a second time because they're not paying some of the stuff Congress appropriated. So again, I think Trump's lying here too. Is like, well, I follow all court opinions and court decisions. I don't think he's gonna. They're pushing. They're going to push the courts to see what they can get away with. And as I mentioned in previous shows, the Supreme Court's orders, we are assuming that people follow court orders here. Well, what happens when they don't? We're going to find out here. Their power is going to be tested. And their ability to provide checks and balances on the executive branch are going to be tested here. Because police courts don't have the police force to enforce their orders. Plus, Trump is also counting on the Supreme Court ultimately. He's going to do all, he's going to appeal all these cases, right? And he's counting on the Supreme Court to rule in his favor since he appointed 3 of them and the Republicans have a 6-3 supermajority on the court. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the Supreme Court. And I hope John Roberts, who calls himself an institutionalist and all this crap that, he's certainly not going by. But let's hope that he finally says, no, enough is enough here. We got to protect the power of the judicial branch from being just ignored by the executive branch. And of course, the Republicans in Congress, right? They're not doing anything here. They're not coming out trying to protect their own ass. Because again, their powers are getting dwindling away here too by what Trump's doing. Trying to get rid of all these agencies and all these workers, and the Republicans are just sitting there going, "Yeah, go ahead. We favor this stuff." Congress is giving away their power here in the name of Trump, right? Now, I think one of the reasons the Republicans are doing this is they agree with what Trump is doing, but they realize they don't have the votes in Congress to do it right now because the House is so darn close. And some of those House members who are Republicans who won in areas that Harris won know that if they, if public sentiment is so bad, it's bad right now against what Trump is doing. But if it gets worse, they're not going to get reelected. And they have a very thin margin in the House. So the Republicans know this. So I think a lot of them support what Trump is trying to do here. But they know they don't have the votes in Congress to close the Department of Education. So, they're not going to do it. Or they're not going to, try and stop him. So, this is where the people power needs to come into play, where we got to really go after our representatives, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, right? So we'll have to see if Trump, basically ignores court orders, what's going to happen. All right, so that is it for the second segment. So as we go to break, we're going to come back and talk some politics. So we'll see you on the other side.
Here come the jesters, 1, 2, 3.
Welcome back to the third segment of today's show of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So, politics. All kinds of things going on here, too. So, first off, let's start in the Minnesota legislature. So now, finally, the Minnesota House is now back in action. The Senate's been in play for a while here, but now the House is back in action because the Republicans caved, despite what they say. They said that they're saying the Democrats caved, but the Republicans caved. They basically took the offer they were offered initially. But at any rate, the House is now in action, and we'll see. There's a special election coming up in March, and the Democrat is going to win that one, and then we're going to have a 67-67 tie in the House. So prior to that time, the Republicans are going to have the speakership job. They're going to have a majority on the committees because, they have that one vote edge right now. But once the special election happens and it goes back to being a tie, the Republicans are still going to get the speakership for, until the next election. So Lisa DeMuth is going to be there for 2 years. I'll get to that here in a little bit. But I think the big part here about the deal that was made is that the Republicans agreed not to challenge the election and the seating of Brad Tapke, the representative from the Shakopee area, where he had won by like 14 votes, and then went to court, and they had court hearings, and the judge came out on Tapke's side, and there was all kinds of litigation here, and so they basically gave that up. Now, there's going to be some ethics hearing in the House that is going to amount to nothing about that election and about what happened to those votes and all this sort of thing. But Tapke's going to be seated; he's going to be there. So, DeMuth is going to she's going to be the speaker till after the 2026 elections, and then once things are tied again, then the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have co-chairs on the committees. You're going to have an equal number of people on the committees from each party, because things are tied. So this is what the power sharing agreement you typically see when there's a tie, although it doesn't happen very often. This is the second time in our history, but it's happened in other states and things like that. And this is kind of, what you usually see. Now, there's also part of this deal was that the Republicans are going to get a committee that is looking for fraud in government programs. And they're going to get them a 5-3 majority on that committee. So this is the one committee where they're going to have a majority. And, of course, they're going to go around looking for fraud. I don't know if they're going to call Elon Musk in to look at it, but, who knows. I don't think they have the money to do it. But they're going to be looking around for fraud in government programs. And, if they find fraud, great. More power to them. I suspect, though, that, that they're just going to use this to criticize Walz and, try and have some influence on the next election. But on the other hand, DeMuth is also giving up some of her powers as speaker. So the parties that they have agreed that the bills that come to the floor for a debate, both parties have to agree to them. So she can't just block legislation on her own like a normal speaker could. So both parties have to agree now to put something up on the floor for debate. That's a pretty big concession. So, of course, the Republicans are blaming the Democrats for walking out, but there's a couple problems here. This is a deal they could have had earlier. They didn't take it. Then they lost in court with this, whole issue about a quorum. Um, Finally, and I think some of the polling that I've seen about this, Minnesota, at least the majority, have favored their Democrats on this issue and saying, yeah, you shouldn't have went there. We're okay with this walkout that you did. So public opinion isn't even on the side of the Republicans here. Now, one thing I'm going to say, and I'll probably talk about this as the session goes on, is please, Democrats, do not cave to the Republicans. You have the Senate. You have the governorship. Don't do anything stupid in the House like you have previously, especially when this is a budget year. Don't do stupid things. Now, I don't want to hear a lot of, well, we got to work with Republicans, so we got to give them some stuff. Well, fine, you can give them some. Don't give them the big stuff. You can throw them a bone or two, but you got the leverage here. You got the Senate, and you got the governor. Don't do anything stupid. All right, another lawsuit has been brought against the Trump administration. So I'm saving this for the politics segment here because this is another one of those things where I thought would be coming down the pipe. I mentioned in a previous show the Quakers had filed a lawsuit saying ICE can't come into our churches and get suspected undocumented immigrants out of the church service or the weddings or the funerals or whatever they're in church for. Well, now 27 other religious groups have now filed a federal lawsuit to prevent ICE from entering their churches to get suspected undocumented people. So this was filed in Washington, D.C. Just the other day. And I suspect you might even see more religious groups doing this. But in this one, there's 27 from around the country. And basically what they're relying on here is a couple different things. First is violation of their Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So this is a federal law that Republicans love to cite for, why you're violating our religious freedom by, making us make wedding cakes for gay people. And all those sorts of cases. They sue under their Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Well, this is going to be, this is one of the laws cited by the plaintiffs in this case. So now you're going to get some of the churches making the political argument here about, well, you're violating our freedom of religion under the First Amendment by doing this. You're also violating our freedom of speech and freedom to peaceably assemble, where, people, doesn't matter if they're undocumented or not, can come to our church, and you can't stop them. So that's the first segment of their lawsuit, is that part. Second part is that the Trump administration, by doing this, is not surprisingly violating the Administrative Procedures Act, which is basically they're changing all these things with no hearings, with no evidence to back it up. They're acting arbitrary and capricious. That's a legal term. So they're asking for injunctions, and I suspect they're going to get them again. And, you would think that Republicans in Congress would be supporting these cases, but they're not. It just doesn't fit their objectives, right? So you don't hear anything from them. You're not even hearing, anything from the press as far as covering this stuff. So speaking of the press, and you know how I love to take the media to task. Well, I'm going to do it again because they were in the White House. This is the White House press staff or people that were in the White House when Trump and Musk were talking. Not one of them asked either one of them for, hey, where's your evidence about waste, fraud, and abuse? We want to see it. What are your claims? Not one of them asked that. This is an obvious question. And they're saying, yeah, we have millions and billions of dollars and all this, right? And like nobody asks them, well, what is your evidence for this? Show it to us. Make it public. This is just another cowardly act by the White House press corps. They're just not doing their jobs. Again, this goes to the double standard that I talked about between Republicans and Democrats. If Biden had been, would be doing all this stuff that Trump is doing, my God, the press would be shouting questions day after day after day, printing all kinds of stories about this, that, and the other thing. But nope, not when it's Trump. Crickets from the White House press corps. This is just shameful. Why aren't you asking these easy questions? Well, I suspect they're like, oh, we don't want to get kicked out of the White House press corps. So they're just being cowards. Next topic here is, how about those tariffs Trump is imposing? And then he's stopping them, and then he's going to impose them again. And now he's doing these across the board, tariffs on aluminum and steel. Well, how's that looking for a Ford Motor Company? Well, the reason I'm bringing this up is that the CEO of Ford, Jim Farley, has come out and said, these tariffs are going to increase costs, and they're going to cause layoffs of workers for Ford. Shocking, I know. I've been saying this for weeks here. He's commenting on the 25% tariff that Trump imposes across the board. Well, your costs are going to go up. We import a lot of supplies and car parts that fit into these, Ford vehicles from other countries that you're not going to be able to get because it's going to cost more, or you're not just going to get them at all because there's no supply out there. This is one of the things that one of my friends who's in the business talks about. He's like, I can't get car parts. Well, this is going to make it harder. So expect delays in getting your vehicles and getting your car parts. If you want to buy a new Ford, you better do it now, because it's just going to get harder and harder to do. So, farmers also are getting stuck with this, where they're going to, lose some of their markets with these tariffs. So remember, if you want some control over your life, you need to be interested in and participate in politics. This is why politics matters to everybody. Talk to you next week.